Así, ¿no? Así se navega.
Sí, así se navega, sí.
Este es pasa atrás.
Y esto, por ejemplo, es para...
Sí, apuntar.
Sí,
Él lo hizo allí. Claro.
Ah.
Entonces es... Allí.
Él lo hizo allí,
Sí,
claro.
Lo hizo allí y luego se...
Claro. Es que es, para nosotros es...
Sí, es...
Claro, es así, claro.
Modern Times.
Sí, esto es. Y esto es para atrás, esto es para adelante, sí. Bueno, empezamos, ¿no? Sí. No, tú espera. Lo metemos en el medio. Ponte aquí en el medio. ¿Empezaste y yo? Sí, eso. Bueno, vamos a dar comienzo a la sesión de la tarde y antes de que el profesor Krusen empiece con su ponencia, me gustaría llamar la atención de todos, que ya nos la ha llamado, pero no tengo... ¿me deja un momentito ahí? Bueno, que te pongas aquí delante, ¿sí? He's very shy. Me gustaría compartir con todos la creación que Francisco ha hecho para este congreso y para todos nosotros, al que ha dedicado muchísimas horas y ha puesto todo su conocimiento y su juventud, es un millennial, y me parece paradójico que haya venido a nosotros con esta creatividad que ha hecho, y todos llevan ustedes en su bolsa de conferenciantes la B de Beato, ¿sí? Y la K de Kells. Esta es la primera vez que se está dando esto. Esto es algo que se ha creado ad hoc y a mí me gustaría especialmente en nombre de la Fundación y del Gobierno darle las gracias por haberlo dado todo para comprender, encima en muy poco tiempo, porque aunque llevamos muchos meses pergeñando esto, realmente condensar todo el conocimiento que hemos visto a través de los dos profesores que hemos tenido, estaremos todos de acuerdo que es difícil. Y él ha salido con esta imagen que a mí, Fran, no se me va a olvidar nunca. Creo que la voy a poner de fondo de pantalla en mi móvil, de fondo de pantalla en el ordenador, etc. Así que les voy a pedir a todos un fuerte aplauso para él. Y ahora, como está sufriendo, ya le voy a dejar irse. Bueno, pues a continuación tenemos el placer de escuchar al profesor Justin Krusen, miembro del Consejo de Future for Religious Heritage, esta organización paneuropea que es la voz del patrimonio religioso-cultural en Europa, que está dedicada a la salvaguarda y promoción precisamente de este patrimonio. Y el señor Krusen es profesor en la Universidad de Bergen, en Noruega, donde imparte su docencia sobre Material Culture of Christianity, la cultura material de la cristiandad. ¿Sí? Bien. Y es responsable de la colección de arte sacro del Museo Universitario, que además yo he tenido la suerte de poder ver en uno de los congresos de FRH. Antes de trasladarse a Noruega, en 2016, trabajó durante más de una década en la Universidad de Groningen, no sé si lo he pronunciado bien, Groningen, en los Países Bajos, dentro del Instituto del Patrimonio Cultural Cristiano de la Facultad de Teología y Estudios Religiosos. Su conferencia lleva por título Un mundo atlántico, arte medieval como una herencia común europea, que es muy importante para abrazar toda la jornada de hoy. Y nos propone una reflexión sobre las conexiones culturales que a lo largo del Atlántico enlazaron distintos territorios europeos en la Edad Media, generando un legado compartido de arte, espiritualidad y conocimiento. Profesor Krusen, muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy y por compartir con nosotros su visión de este mundo atlántico del patrimonio religioso europeo. Cuando quieras.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Pilar, for these nice words of introduction. Thank you a lot also for the invitation to be here together with you today in Cantabria, in this very historical place with more than 1,000 years of history and art history. Much more history even. So thanks very much for including me in this seminar. Now I have to find out how this will work. Yes. So since I started working in Norway in 2016, I've tried to present Norwegian medieval church art first and foremost as European heritage. Studies on medieval art in Norway, however, have traditionally mostly searched for its unique, distinct Nordic aspect. Authors have looked for influences from Viking art, for example, to argue that Scandinavian art is different from artworks found further south. And an example of this should work. No. Vale. This is a view of my church art collection at the museum of the University Museum in Bergen, just to give you a small impression of the wonderful treasures that we possess. An example of this is this figure of the Virgin and Child from Urnes, which, with its long trenches on both sides, has been interpreted as a representation of a Viking woman. This would be the Viking Mary. The truth is, however, that Marian figures from the 12th century with tresses are found also elsewhere in Europe. For example, this Marian figure in Dijon, known as Notre-Dame de Bon Espoir. She also has two tresses. So I think here wishful thinking rooted in 19th century Romanticism had certainly steered art historical interpretation. The Marian type of the Urnes Virgin in our collection is clearly based on French models, such as the famous Notre-Dame de la Carole from the Basilica of Saint-Martin-des-Champs in Paris and now kept in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. Here, the trenches on both sides have become or are two bands of her robe that make the same downward movement over her chest and shoulders. The parallel pleats that gently swing out between the shoes at the bottom are really very similar. So rather than calling her a Scandinavian Madonna, I would prefer to look for her origins in northern France. Important arguments in the Romantic approach, I would say, to Norwegian art history have been the country's famous stavkirker, the stave churches, the wooden churches, which already caught the attention of painters and scholars during the 19th century. Out of around 1,500 stave churches that must have existed in medieval Norway, only 27 remain standing today. The famous stave church of Borgund, with its dragon heads peeking out from the rooftops, features in many paintings from the era, from the 19th century. When Norwegians started restoring the surviving stave churches all across the country, Borgund, this church on the left, served as the ultimate model to follow. So, for example, when the stave church in Hopperstad on the right was restored in the mid-19th century, elements were copied from Borgund and applied to the church to make it look more Viking and more exotic, for that matter. The tendency to set Norway's medieval art and stave churches apart from Romanesque art in other parts of Europe still lingers on. There are hardly any studies that look at contemporary churches in wood and stone taken together. A welcome recent exception to this is the book on Urnes Stave Church and its global Romanesque connections, edited by Kirk Ambrose, Griffin Murray, and Margrethe Stuurstad Andås in 2022. And here it's shown that many features of the stave churches, and Urnes in particular, are in fact translations into wood of forms from Romanesque architecture in stone. such as, for example, the cushion capitals shown here in the photo on the right. It should also be noted that although Romanesque churches in wood today are virtually exclusive to Norway, this was not the case at the time. Many medieval churches in Germany, the Netherlands, and England are known to have had predecessors in wood. In fact, the oldest preserved wooden church in Western Europe is found in Greenstead, just north of London, here in the picture. Its nave is entirely built from vertical logs placed in a row using a technique which is known in Norwegian as a stolpekirke, a trunk church. And it's also been suggested, bringing the argument also further south, that the typical consoles that peek out in Romanesque stone architecture under the roof, which in Spanish are known as canecillos, may reflect the form of wooden bench ends from an earlier phase when many churches were largely built in wood. So wooden church architecture in the Middle Ages was much more common and widespread than today's picture suggests. As exotic as stave churches may look at first sight, their ground plans, if we look at it here, share much more characteristics with Romanesque stone architecture in other parts of Western Europe. Here we see the ground plan of Borgund stave church on the left, compared to that of the church in Vallespinoso de Aguilar. Just wanted to take an example not too far from here, in the province of Palencia in the north of Spain. What both churches have in common is the basic structure, which is composed of a rectangular nave, a narrower chancel, and semicircular apse on the east side. The defining difference of the stave churches is their bearing structure, as the building is not supported by the outer walls, as in the stone church, but by the poles in the interior of the building called the staves. So that's why they're called the stave churches. They don't rest on their walls, they rest on the staves. And there is the wood carving surrounding the portals of the stave churches. In Norway today, 126 such portals are wholly or largely preserved, both in churches in the field and in museums. My collection in Bergen includes around 20 examples. Most are surrounded and covered in intricate carved decorations that show an intertwining of plant and animal motifs. Many portals feature dragons whose tails become tendrils and then densely braided together. At the time, however, the structure of many such portals follows that of portals in stone from the same period. The portals from Stedje Stave Church in our collection, for example, as shown here, are composed of half columns on the sides that carry capitals which serve as supports for a round arch, the same elements found in stone architecture of the period. And even the carvings themselves, as you can see here on the left, and even the carvings themselves are less different from those found in stone architecture than is often thought. Many of the same motifs are also found in the portals of Romanesque stone churches, for example, as shown here in Ely in England, or also in the Cathedral of Pavia in northern Italy. These forms are more widespread than one might think. The door jambs from Hyllestad and the Setesdal in southern Norway, which are now preserved at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, are famous for their iconographic program. They show various scenes from the life of Sigurd, who slays the dragon, Fafnir, and roasts his heart before killing also Regin, who had forged his sword. These are oral traditions from the Viking Age that were given a new meaning after Christianity had arrived at Norway's shores, as a tale about the struggle between good and evil. They were given a new meaning in a Christian context. The most famous carved stave church portal in Norway is found on the right, shown in Urnes, which features on the UNESCO list of World Heritage. These motifs, these decorations, 70, has even given its name to a style period known as the Urnes style. And this Urnes style is generally considered as the last phase of Viking art. But how Viking is the Urnes style really? Remarkably few scholars have asked this question since the periodization of medieval art history was established in the late 19th century. A couple of weeks ago, however, at a medieval meeting in Bergen, my colleague from Oslo, Ingeborg Magerøy, set question marks at the traditional interpretation. In her lecture, she compared the style characteristics of the Urnes portal with decorative pleating found in the early medieval book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and other manuscripts from the 7th to the 9th centuries. And she concludes that much more than from Viking art, whatever it is, the Urnes style was derived from the art that was developed in the British Isles. And this meant that Norwegian art was perhaps much more shaped by overseas influences than traditionally thought. To understand what shaped Nordic medieval art, we might look less inward, less to Scandinavia than has been done to date, and more outward, overseas. So in the rest of this lecture today, I would like to take you on a tour through medieval art and look for overseas Atlantic connections. So let's focus on several elements we find in medieval churches along the coast of Western Europe and ask ourselves to what extent they were shaped by the sea, by the Atlantic. And this question is certainly relevant also here in Cantabria, a part of southern Europe that has always looked northward out over the Cantabrian Sea. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Atlantic has been a contact zone and a thoroughfare of all kinds of produce that was shipped to and fro, literally between Finland and Finisterre. Needless to say, this also included art. Since art had a fair chance to survive in the sheltered space of churches, today I want to look at medieval artworks that are preserved in or from churches on the Atlantic coast of Europe. Medieval church art is not art in the modern sense, of course, as most objects served as furnishings and utensils used in church rituals. What we will see is that such furnishings were remarkably mobile. And to understand this, it's important to keep in mind that with the Christianization of Scandinavia, all of Western Europe had become religiously united under the Church of Rome. In every parish church, in every town and village across this vast area, people needed the same furnishings and utensils to celebrate the very same ritual, namely Mass. And this means that between the 12th and 16th centuries, Scandinavians and Iberians, in order to furnish their churches, would consider roughly the same options when looking out for altar decorations, sculptures, vestments, vessels, baptismal fonts, and so forth. Various cities in Atlantic Europe, particularly in the central area, in South England, in northern France, and in the Low Countries, developed into vibrant centers of art production, church art production, which was then shipped in all directions. In the coming half an hour or so, I will present and explain the striking similarities found between artworks in places that may lie up to thousands of kilometers apart. The first category of liturgical furnishings we will discuss is the baptismal font. These have survived in relatively high numbers across Atlantic Europe, from Norway to Spain. Fonts are often the oldest preserved elements in churches, and they sometimes even predate the now standing church building. One obvious reason for their survival is the fact that they're executed in resistant materials, including stone and metal, and the fact that they were more often than other pieces of church furniture maintained at the time of the Reformation in countries that became Protestant. They just had better chances to survive over the centuries. During the 12th century, the town of Tournai, in what is now the west of Belgium, developed into a thriving export center of baptismal fonts that were hewn from the locally found dark limestone. Tournai fonts found their way to churches across Flanders, for example Zedelgem and Dendermonde, and to northern France, for example to Montdidier and Saint-Just-en-Chaussée. But examples were also in the same period shipped over the sea, over the North Sea to England, where we find examples in the cathedrals of Winchester and Lincoln, for example. And today, therefore, to understand Tournai's medieval sculpture, we should study churches on both sides of the Channel, in Belgium and France, but also in England. Another remarkable and little studied phenomenon in Romanesque font making is the spread of examples that were cast in lead on both sides of the English Channel. Here we see the examples in the churches of Brookland in Kent, and from where they found their way to churches all over the Low Countries. Namur fonts were also shipped further afield, further north especially, until Denmark, as is shown by the font in Thunder in the southwest of that country. All these movements of fonts in all directions have led to a font landscape of Western Europe that is characterized by both unity and diversity. Unity in the size and shape and iconography of fonts, and diversity in the use of materials that were locally available or could be shipped to where they were made, as well as concerning decorative patterns. And this is why fonts that were not produced in the same workshop or even in the same area can still show remarkable levels of similarity. An excellent illustration of this is the depiction of the harrowing of hell, showing Christ descending into limbo, as is portrayed on these two fonts found in Middels in German East Frisia and in Calahorra de Boedo in the province of Palencia in northern Spain. Although the craftsmen who carved both fonts worked in places that are more than 2,000 kilometers apart, they clearly followed the same, or maybe not the same, but similar models. And this means that there must have been depictions that circulated all over the continent. Another basic element of church furnishings in the Middle Ages clearly reflects overseas relationships is the chancel screen. These are two early 14th century stone screens found to the west and the east of the North Sea. The one on the left is in the Cathedral of Norwegian Trondheim, and the one on the right in the parish church of Great Bartfield in Essex in England. The designs of the two screens are so similar that there can be no doubt that they were carried out by masters that had been trained in the same milieu, which no doubt must be sought in England. In the 15th and 16th centuries, richly carved wooden screens with galleries, known as roodlofts, became known and common around the North Sea and beyond. Examples of a similar design can be found on all coasts surrounding the North Sea, from Flamborough in Yorkshire in northern England to Holwierde in the province of Groningen in the Netherlands. But similar models are also further south in French Brittany. The two examples here are preserved in rural churches in the Breton countryside, where they are known as chapelles. These are among the best preserved of their kind, as they often also preserve, especially on the right you can see that, the crucifix or the Calvary group that was placed on top. A complete ensemble of a screen, loft and Calvary group a gallery, a loft is a gallery, and a Calvary group has survived in the chapel of Saint-Fiacre in Le Fauet. It offers the best impression of such galleries, of how such galleries once looked like, also in Britain and in the Netherlands, where all figurative carvings were taken down at the time of the Reformation. So in this case, to understand Dutch and English church screens, we should turn to France. So we study elements of church architecture and church furnishings by looking overseas. The southern Netherlands, between the Meuse Valley, Tournai and Flanders, also became a production and export center of brass products, including many eagle lecterns, as shown here. These fittings found their way across the Low Countries and also to England, with examples found in Halle in Belgium near Brussels and Croft in Lincolnshire. In England, I could add many, many more. But examples were also shipped further south. For example, to Castro Reales on the coast here in Cantabria. So here we see that the landscape extends not only to the west, to the north, but also to the south. So this is an example of Atlantic art. The most prestigious element in every medieval church was the high altar in the chancel, which was the focal point of the sacred space. It was here that high mass was performed and that communities celebrated their collective identity through their patron saints. Parishes invested much money and effort in decorating their high altars with the best possible artworks, including paintings, carvings, and sculptures, as well as precious textiles and vessels, that all contributed to a liturgy that was a magnificent ritual, that was a magnificent ritual as possible. An early form of altar decoration that was common until the 14th century was the altar frontal, also known as antependium, which covered the front of the altar block, creating a visual focus and often also visualizing the church dedication. Painted wooden altar frontals developed a striking similarity across Western Europe, as is illustrated by these two examples from the mid-13th century. One is found in the church of Skaun, near Trondheim in Norway, and the one on the right, is from the church of Santa Maria d'Avià in Catalonia, now preserved in the National Museum of Catalan Art in Barcelona. Both these panels not only share a similar size and internal structure, with the central Virgin and Child under a trefoil arch, but also roughly the same iconographical program. They show the same Marian scenes distributed in the very same manner. So here again, artists working thousands of kilometers apart. The frontals were probably made around Trondheim and the other one around Barcelona, must have had access to the same models. But we find similar patterns everywhere in Europe, as is illustrated by these two examples that date to the first half of the 14th century. The one on the left is dedicated to St. Nicholas and originates from Mödruvellir, a monastery on the north coast of Iceland, and is now preserved in the National Museum of Reykjavik. Given that Iceland has no wood, because there are no trees on the island, it must have been imported from overseas. And it was most probably produced in Norway, under which archbishopric it fell, but England is also a possibility. The frontal on the right comes from Andrados de Ordaz, between León and Ponferrada, not so far from where we are today, and is now preserved in the Diocesan Museum in León. Although the Icelandic one is painted and the Leonese one is carved, both frontals share the same basic traits, including their internal structure and the architectural motifs that crown the central figure. In the 13th century, many altars throughout Western Europe were adorned with sculptures of the Virgin and Child or of a saint placed on top of them. Many such sculptures were placed inside so-called tabernacle shrines. The spread of this object type shown here, which has been one of my central research topics in recent years, was a pan-European phenomenon, as we find examples, very similar examples, everywhere between Finland and Finisterre. A spectacular example is the shrine from Castil Delgado in the province of Burgos, which is now preserved in the Museu Frederic Marès in Barcelona. Here on the slide. Dating from around 1300, it originally held the Virgin and Child that is still kept in the parish church of Castil Delgado. So here they've been put together, the shrine from the museum and the Virgin and Child from the church. It consists of a tall shrine with arches on three sides and an architecturally shaped crowning that can be closed using four wings, and the wings shown can be folded around the shrine, and they have carved scenes on the insides. The baldachin on top of the Virgin and Child in Castil Delgado is similar to the design of the shrine from Vanaja in Finland, which is now in the National Museum of Helsinki. And although both shrines are obviously created in places that lie far apart, their style is not the same, they share several important characteristics in terms of their structure and decoration. The most spectacular 13th century Virgin and Child sculpture preserved in the collection in Bergen at the University Museum is the one from the church of Hove on the Sognefjord in western Norway. The sculpture has lost its feet, but preserves almost all its gilding and polychromy, in addition to its partly gilded canopy shrine. Hinges on both sides of the back panel still remind of the presence of four folding wings, the same type as we saw in the shrine from Castil Delgado. The Virgin from Hove, like many other contemporary sculptures in Norway, was traditionally believed to be an English import. But the lack of preserved examples in that country makes further specifications impossible. In 2014, my colleague from Oslo, Un Plater, related the Hove Madonna to examples in Flanders and northern France, such as this one, known as the Notre-Dame de Miracle in the Cathedral of Saint-Omer in the north of France, which is historically on the border with Flanders. Both sculptures are almost identical to the extent that both sculptures may have been produced in the same workshop around 1230-1240. However, the French sculpture has lost all of its original polychromy, and it is probable that it originally, like the Hove Madonna, stood inside a now vanished tabernacle shrine. And this means that the people from northern France who wish to better understand what their Virgin and Child originally looked like should travel to Norway to study their twin sister, or her twin sister, from the fjords. I think this is a striking thought, but one that makes very clear how we should think about the map of medieval Europe, starting not from land, but rather from the water. Flip the map from green to blue. Sculptures of the Virgin and Child of very similar models are actually found all over Europe. This example is preserved in the Museum Katrijnenconvent in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And it is traditionally connected to the Meuse Valley, perhaps around Liège, because of several sculptures preserved in that area, which are stylistically very similar. But none of them has preserved more of their original polychromy and gilding, and nothing is known about how they were originally located on the altars in their respective churches. And here is where Icelandic medieval art comes in to provide important answers. This figure of the Virgin and Child, here on the right, stems from the small church of Muli on the north coast of Iceland, and it's now kept at the Danish National Museum of Copenhagen. It is stylistically very close to the one in the Katrijnenconvent and the sculptures in Belgium she is associated with, so they can all be said to belong to the same family from the middle of the 13th century. The Virgin and Child from Iceland, however, is the only one that preserves its tabernacle shrine, again with 4 folding doors, albeit now without the carved scenes that originally filled the interiors of these doors. Again, this shows us the importance of the Atlantic dimension really well. An Icelandic sculpture, preserved in Denmark, provides answers to questions that started from sculptures in the Low Countries. There can be little doubt that the models for the whole family, this one, but many more families at the time, must be sought not on Iceland or in Norway, but rather in the center, in northern France. It was this region, the home of the Gothic cathedral, that was by far the most creative and innovative landscape of the time. The model of the Gothic cathedral was literally exported to all over Europe during the 13th century, east to Cologne and Prague, south to León and Toledo, and north to Trondheim and Uppsala. The monumental sculptures from the facade of Trondheim Cathedral that are now kept at the museum in the local Archbishop's Palace, shown on the left, are clearly hewn by sculptors from France, or at least by masters who had been trained there. They strongly remind of classical Gothic sculpture, as is found on the Cathedral of Reims, for example. And to the right, this almost life-sized sculpture of a deacon bearing a book in our collection in Bergen is clearly inspired on contemporary French models, such as the figure of the Saint Stephen, of the deacon Saint Stephen on the portal of the Cathedral of Sens in northern Burgundy. It's literally, you could say, a translation into wood. The Black Death of 1348-1349 and the ensuing economic crisis of the 14th century had a deeply negative impact on the circulation of artworks, styles, and motifs in Atlantic Europe. And here we see this famous image, how the citizens of Tournai, perhaps including the stone carvers who made the famous fonts that we saw earlier, are burying their dead. By the time the different parts of Europe re-emerged in the early 15th century, the striking unity in medieval art, in European art, as we've seen so far, gradually made way to a remarkable diversity. The best way to visualize this is by looking at the landscape of retables or altarpieces. In altarpiece making, England, the Low Countries, and northern Germany now all developed their own distinct types and models of winged altarpieces and started competing on an international market, in this case, an Atlantic market. Several of these types reached the Iberian Peninsula, although here, as we'll see later on, people also developed a very distinct type of altarpiece according to their own preferences. English altarpiece making concentrated around Nottingham, where relatively small wooden triptychs with reliefs carved from alabaster were made in series for both the domestic and the exporting market. In Britain itself, as a result of the Protestant iconoclasm, hardly any such alabaster altarpieces have survived. An important exception is the so-called Swansea altarpiece, shown at the top here in the slide, from that town in Wales, which is now preserved at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Most English alabaster altarpieces today are found on other shores, overseas, where they were exported to. Many ended up around the North Sea, for example in Borbjerg on Danish Jutland, as is shown below. An English altarpiece in a Danish church. They were also exported further east to the Baltic, as becomes clear from this example in Polish Gdansk. The largest stock of preserved English alabaster altarpieces is, perhaps remarkably, found in Iceland. We also already mentioned Iceland a couple of times, important for its medieval art, not only for the volcanoes. Apart from the complete example from the monastery of Munkadvera, which is now kept in the Danish National Museum in Copenhagen, shown here. The National Museum of Iceland in Reykjavik possesses no less than 5 further English altarpieces. And together, all these altarpieces eloquently illustrate why the 15th century in Icelandic cultural history is commonly known as the English Sanctuary. In this period, most connections passed through the port of Lynn, now King's Lynn, in Norfolk. But English alabasters were also exported to places further south, including Bordeaux, southwestern France, where we find 2 examples in the Collegiate Church of Saint-Seurin and 1 in the Basilica of Saint-Michel. And closer to here, in the Basque Country, the Diocesan Museum in Bilbao possesses the reliefs of an English alabaster retable from Plencia, close to Bilbao, a port located on the coast of Biscay. Further west in Spain, in Santiago de Compostela, the Museum of the Cathedral preserves an English altarpiece with alabaster reliefs showing scenes from the life of Saint James. It was donated to the cathedral in 1456 by John Goodyear, who was a priest from the Isle of Wight off the English south coast during his pilgrimage to the tomb of the apostle. And further south in Lisbon, we find the alabaster panels from a further English altarpiece in the Archaeological Museum in the Church of the Carmo, showing the remarkable spread of these English products in the 15th century. After the middle of the 15th century, the English altarpieces were gradually pushed out of the market by the rise of the Netherlandish altarpiece, especially those produced in Brabant, in towns of Brussels, Mechelen, Malines, and Antwerp. About 330 Flemish winged altarpieces are preserved across Europe today, of which 93 are in Germany and 84 in what is nowadays Belgium. So most Belgian altarpieces are now found in Germany. Then follow Sweden and Spain, with both around 40 examples. The Cathedral of Swedish Strängnäs, here on the slide, holds a European record with 3 Brabant altarpieces preserved in the same church, 2 made in Brussels and 1 made in Antwerp. Although Sweden became Protestant, Lutheran, in around 1530, the Lutherans were much more tolerant to medieval art than the Protestants in the Netherlands and England. And the same is true of Lutheran Denmark and Germany, where relatively many late medieval altarpieces have survived, are preserved, often even with fully intact polychromies. In Fristuna, a village church south of Stockholm, for example, we find this perfect Antwerp altarpiece from the early 16th century. It was imported by the local parish, a small community of farmers who apparently knew their way around the international market and chose to purchase their altarpiece in the Brabant port city. So they must have had contacts, direct or indirect, to Antwerp. And one of the largest Antwerp altarpieces preserved anywhere in Europe, dating from around 1520, is even found in the extreme north of Sweden, shown on the right here, in the church of Neder-Luleå. Trade here concentrated on tar, furs, and fish, which apparently generated enough riches to purchase this grandiose shrine from a workshop in the southern Netherlands. Some Brabant altarpieces in Scandinavia clearly reflect the preferences of their clients. For example, here in Uterseler on the left, where the 3 figures in the shrine, that was produced in Brussels around 1500, represent the Virgin and Child between the local Swedish saints Bodvit and Eskil. Bodvit and Eskil. Saints that hardly anybody had ever heard about outside the region. The Antwerp shrine in Norwegian Ringsaker differs from standard Brabant altarpieces in that its wings, here on the right, are not painted but fully carved and filled with individual figures. This altarpiece was commissioned around 1528, shortly before the Reformation, by the local priest Ansten Jonsson Skunk. And apparently, again, this man had the means and the contacts to have it made and shipped to his village, located north of Oslo. So in these cases, we clearly find altarpieces that were commissioned in the southern Netherlands, but following the preferences of the buyers. Brabant altarpieces were also widely exported to the Iberian world, including several examples found in the Basque country. The parish church in the port town of Lekeitio in Biscay possesses a Brussels Passion retable dating from around 1500, here on the left. A beautiful and much more complex Brussels shrine dated to 1521 is found in another Basque port town on the right, namely Errenteria in Gipuzkoa. These altarpieces reached their destination in the context of flourishing trade between Castile and Flanders, with the Cantabrian coast being a stopover on the way to Burgos, Medina del Campo, and other places. Merchants from Biscay, in their turn, and Castile each maintained their own consulates in Bruges. So there must really have been a very intense trade going on. Brabant altarpieces were also shipped much further south over the Atlantic, to Madeira in the Canary Islands. These artworks reached the islands partly in exchange for sugar, which generated great wealth from the late 15th century onward. Several Flemish families were involved in the sugar trade here, including a certain Jacob Groenenberg, who imported several altarpieces from Brabant to La Palma. And on Madeira, we found this beautiful altarpiece from around 1450 in the Quinta das Cruzes Museum, and an Antwerp retable from circa 1520 in the chapel of Estreito de Calheta, both shown on the right. The latter shows the two commissioners in the wings, on the painted wings, the merchant Francisco Omen da Gouveia and his wife Isabel Afonso on the wings. And soon after, as is well known, Flemish artworks would not even be shipped to the southern European Atlantic, but even over the Atlantic to the Spanish colonies in Mexico and elsewhere, ending in the real globalization, you could say, of Flemish art. Like in Scandinavia, some altarpieces from the Netherlands in Spain also reflect the desires of their individual commissioners. In the Church of San Salvador in Valladolid, we find this large winged altarpiece that has really no parallel in Flanders in terms of its size and format. It was commissioned in Antwerp in the year 1504 by Gonzalo González de Illescas, a judge and advisor to the Spanish crown, and his wife Marina de Estrada. The square form of the altarpiece and the presence of a large standing figure of the patron saint, St. John the Baptist, in the center, no doubt correspond or responded to the desires of the Spanish commissioners. This is a side altar, this is a side chapel of that church. But for the high altarpieces, Spaniards around 1500 preserved or preferred altarpieces of a completely different scale. So many larger churches in Spain, including cathedrals and urban parish churches, had altarpieces erected that covered the entire east wall of the chancel, with a large number of carved figures and scenes. This altarpiece was created in the Cathedral of Oviedo in Asturias between 1512 and 1529. Remarkably, most of the carvers were not Spaniards, but Netherlanders, mostly from Brabant, to judge by their names. The crew was led by Giralte de Bruselas, which means Gerard of Brussels. They worked together with Spanish carpenters in the realization of a giant altarpiece of a size and scale they had never seen in their countries of origin. So you could say that in this way, by the movement of the artists, not of the artworks, but the artists to other shores, the Atlantic connection between Castile and Flanders not only led to the exchange of artworks, but also to new hybrid forms of art, It's in the exchange that something new is generated. Altarpieces such as this one are Flemish in style, but undeniably Spanish in scale. And this is what I meant when I talked about diversity within unity, or connected diversity earlier. In Scandinavia, altarpieces produced in northern Germany also found a fertile market. Many were carved in workshops in the city of Lübeck, a leading member of the Hanseatic League. Lübeck altarpieces spread across the Baltic region, especially to Sweden and Denmark, but also to Norway, where we find this example in the Church of St. Mary in my hometown of Bergen. Since the 14th century, the Hanseates had maintained their trade post at the Bryggen area in the harbor, from where they provided all of Europe with Norwegian cod, or bacalhau. The Germans had taken over the Church of St. Mary at Bryggen, and when they were looking for a new altarpiece around 1500, it is hardly surprising that they should purchase it in Lübeck, where many of them came from. So they looked back to their hometown. The German connection can also be seen much further north, where bacalhau was caught, where the codfish was caught and dried in the polar wind as stockfish, stoccafisso in Italian. Here we see the interior of the parish church at Trondenes, the world's northernmost preserved medieval church. I myself was here just a couple of days ago to attend the presentation of a book that we published together with several colleagues in Norway. The ensemble of 3 altars standing in a row in the same chancel is impressive and, to my knowledge, unparalleled in Europe today. The altarpieces on the high altar and on the left side altar were most probably produced in Lübeck, northern Germany. But the one on the southern side altar, on the right, however, has a very different build-up, a very different color scheme and a very different build-up. My colleague Kristin Kousland in Oslo has recently attributed it to a workshop in the east of the Netherlands, possibly between Zwolle and Deventer, or a little bit further south on the lower Rhine, perhaps Kalkar, and she connects it to the work of Meister Arndt van Kalkar, also known as Arndt of Zwolle. This is very important as a discovery for Dutch art history, since in the Netherlands themselves hardly any such altarpieces have survived the Calvinist iconoclasm of the 16th century. So the art found in the church of Trondenes is therefore truly Atlantic, and an illustration of how art was part of the same market as the wood, the cloth, the wine, the wheat, the leather, the tar, the sugar and the fish that they were traded for. In this case, it was art for fish, as it was art for sugar on the Canary Islands and Madeira. Our collection in Bergen also includes an altarpiece that was produced in the Netherlands. Another one recently discovered in our collection, possibly in Utrecht or in Amsterdam. It dates from around 1510 and stems from the church of Austevoll, a small fishing village south of Bergen. The saints on the sides are St. Peter and St. Mary Magdalene, who were venerated around Europe. No big surprise here. They could certainly be ordered from the catalogue, so to speak, at the workshop. But the female saint in the middle was not so well known overseas. This is Saint Sunniva, Norway's first Christian saint, who was also the patron saint of Bergen and Western Norway. The Norwegian fishermen from this village of Austevoll on an island must have had to explain to the Netherlandish carvers, in Utrecht for example, who Sunniva was and what she looked like. Just like England, the Netherlands, or Utrecht, Brabant, just like England, Brabant and northern Germany, the northern Netherlands, concentrated around Utrecht, also exported their altarpieces to all over Western Europe. Utrecht seems to have played a central role here, developing its own brand of wooden altarpieces that were filled with reliefs made of terracotta. Examples of these mixed media works of art are preserved in places as far apart as Widbjerg on Danish Jutland and Four-en-Vexin between Paris and Rouen. The Spanish monastery of San Antonio el Real in Segovia, north of Madrid, even possesses 3 small winged altarpieces with reliefs in terracotta that are also believed to have been produced in Utrecht. So here we see an Utrecht collection now found dispersed over several countries. In the lecture I gave today, I focused mainly on medieval artworks of painted wood, but the same case could be made by looking at metal vessels or textile vestments. You would find the same types of landscape. Regarding the latter, England, Cologne, and the Netherlands all became important centers of production and export. English chasubles and copes, known as opus anglicanum, ended up all over the continent, including Stavanger in the west of Norway, where the cathedral possessed an important relic of the English Saint Swithin of Winchester. And in my Bergen collection, we have a chasuble from the village church of Jørundfjord, also in western Norway, that was made with the Netherlandish orphreys and a base of Venetian velvet, which reminds us of the circulation of products even beyond Atlantic Europe, around the Mediterranean, and even intertwined. And so the Mediterranean networks and the Atlantic networks here come together in the very same object. To conclude, we can now say that the remarkable movements of all the medieval artworks discussed in my lecture reveal a vast Atlantic network that stretched from Iceland all the way down to the Canary Islands. To understand the medieval art history of any of the regions in this area, the art found on other coasts is of direct relevance, even if it's located thousands of kilometers apart. As we've seen, tabernacle shrines in France can be understood through their parallels in Scandinavia and in Spain. And in the same manner, English and Dutch altarpieces only become tangible through examples that are preserved in Norway or Spain, outside the countries where they were made. And I would like to finish my lecture today with 2 important ideas. The first is that religious heritage, including church art, as I have mentioned it in the past hour, is of great importance to remind us of our shared cultural past. Churches are the keepers of a great deal of our collective memory as communities, both local and European, the local history and the connected European history. When a church disappears, therefore, we lose a connection to our ancestors, and with that, part of our identity. And this is what Future for Religious Heritage tries to avoid, finding new ways and arousing public interest in historic places of worship. Over the past years, Pilar Bamonde has been FRH's frontwoman, making an incredible effort. Thank you so much for that, Pilar. And the second thought I would like to conclude with is that we should keep looking over borders. In my lecture today, I presented the Atlantic as one big connected contact zone, where Icelanders, Norwegians, Danes, Britons and Bretons, Dutchmen, Flemings and Frenchmen, Basques, Galicians, Castilians, Cantabrians, Portuguese, all met and mingled. They sometimes may have fought each other, but they also very often forged friendships that enabled the exchange of products and ideas. This idea of the sea as a connector rather than a division is an important inspiration for my research. As we've seen at the beginning of my talk, we cannot understand our art history if we do not look over borders. To keep on looking for the origins of Norwegian art only in Norway, for example, would be a great mistake and would lead us really astray. However, if we look over borders and take the connecting sea as our point of departure, then Norwegian, Dutch, Irish and Spanish art all come to the fore as the cultural heritage of an Atlantic world of which we are all heirs. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Por la ponencia.
Y ahora, ¿cómo hacemos ahora? Vamos justitos de tiempo para el debate, sí, pero si alguien quiere hacer, tenemos tiempo para una o dos preguntas y comenzamos, si no, el debate. Si a alguien le surge la pregunta después, pues la puede hacer, obviamente, que es un debate para todos. Sí.
Okay, thank you, Justin. It was as good as we expected. For a man of your caliber. Thank you for that. So, Justin, two questions. First of all, is there an example of a school of crafts folk that were producing and that attracted an international body of students at that time? Is there any example of people gathering together from different countries to study in a particular place under a particular person or in a particular environment? And the second question is just, I wonder whether you've got any thoughts on surprising adaptations. So in other words, where you've seen similar types of work, but with certain distinctions reflecting local culture or a cultural difference from one, as something is transported from one country to another, it's, you know, as I say, it's changed to accommodate local sensitivities.
I think that to answer the last question, I think the strongest examples I can think of, I presented a couple of altar pieces that were adjusted to the local cults of saints. So I think it's especially the saints that these people wanted to see that are found in the altar pieces. So in that sense, they're adjusted. Saint Sunniva, commissioned by the Norwegians, who the Utrecht carver certainly had never heard of. So this is a Norwegian cult object made in the Netherlands, and the studying migration of artists in let's say the 14th and 15th centuries in Atlantic Europe is quite difficult to trace because there's so little left of written sources. I think the best possibilities would probably be in England, where we have no artworks left. So in the end, in Norway we have the objects but not the sources. And in England, you have a lot of sources, but not the artwork. So I think if you put these together as a puzzle, you might come a little bit further. But it's not an easy task. I think if we compare it to what happens around the Mediterranean, where from the 14th century you have splendid cases of migration of artists that went to, Spaniards, for example, went to Italy to study and brought the style of Italy back home. You know the names of these artists, especially in Catalonia and Aragon. We can only dream of that. We have no names of artists in medieval Norway, for example. Northern Germany also is basically anonymous artworks until the arrival of the Reformation. So it's very difficult.
Muchas gracias por la conferencia. Pensaba que lo que aprendemos con el trabajo de la Fundación Futuro para el Patrimonio Religioso y los estudios de la Edad Media es que hay una identidad intercultural que compartimos y pensaba hasta qué punto tenemos que deconstruir ahora esta idea de identidad nacional tan fuerte, ¿no?, que está sobre todo a partir del siglo finales del XVIII y principios del XIX, ¿no? Entonces, quería preguntarle si esa es una idea, es decir, o ya en el arte también se ve que esta idea de identidad nacional separatista tiene raíces anteriores.
So the question is about the art and nationalism, about constructing national identities using artworks. Of course, that's the way art history more or less developed. Art history doesn't go any further back than that. So art history is very much charged with a nationalistic rhetoric all around it. So not even only on the national scale, also on a more local level. For example, the city of Lübeck that I mentioned a couple of times has, in the 19th century, invented itself as the capital of the Hanse. whereas they never were any capital of any sort. Hanze was never a kingdom or something like that. But so Lübeck created this myth of the best art in Northern Europe as being created in Lübeck, and that idea still lingers on until today. So it's not even only national, but also regional. And of course, my plea of this afternoon is to look over these borders and to think about a connected world where there is no such thing as Lübeck art. There's European art which was made in Lübeck. There's European art made in Burgos, and there's European art made in Florence. And they all have their own flavors, but they are very much also sharing a lot of commonalities. And of course, it's a matter of choice. You could focus on what makes them different, which is interesting, to look at what makes an altarpiece from Spain different from one in Germany. But I would rather flip the perspective and look for what they have in common, because that way it's easier to trace what we have in common, the European underlying unity that is so fascinating, that people in the Middle Ages could understand each other even if they didn't speak their own, even did not speak their languages. A Portuguese traveler in the 15th century traveling to Finland would need no explanation to know what's going on in the church. He would probably feel most at home in the church because it was just like in his home village. That is I think it's a very strong idea. Yeah.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Vamos a dar un... Sí. Perdón.
Thank you, Justin, for this lecture, but you said that you wanted to make a view over the borders, but on your map was a strict border between the blue world and the red world, and I'm interested to know, is it a strict border in the art history, or is it only for yourself? And where's the mixture between the worlds?
No, it's absolutely not a strict border. It is actually a very permeable border. It's a very fluid border. The only thing is that I've looked for a map about the watershed, because my idea was, how can I visualize Atlantic Europe? Well, to divide Europe between lands where the rivers flow into the Atlantic from the lands where the rivers flow into the Mediterranean. But of course, the Mediterranean was as much part of that family of Christian nations, regions, whatever you want to call it. So we should actually, to have the complete picture, also include the red colored regions. Thank you.
I think this is it, yeah? This is the explanation that you were saying. Okay. Bueno, pues entonces, si les parece bien, vamos a pasar a la parte ya del debate, en la que los ponentes y los miembros de FRH se van a sentar aquí, nos vamos a sentar aquí y vamos a plantear una pregunta, una digresión y, bueno, todos podemos participar, vamos a verter aquí nuestras opiniones y, por supuesto, están invitados todos los que estamos aquí presentes y los que están en streaming para aportar o preguntar. ¿Sí? Sí. So, please now, members of FRH, Council and speakers, Mr. Miham and Mr. Castiñeiras, if you want to join us here. Yeah. conversion. So all of us have the question more or less in English. I'm going to say it in Spanish, and if you need it, I will say it in English again. ¿Ya? ¿Sí? Entonces, el debate que planteamos aquí todos juntos en este congreso sobre el patrimonio bibliográfico religioso de Europa, patrimonio religioso europeo, cultural, identitario, el futuro de este patrimonio. Cuando pensamos en patrimonio religioso, la mayoría de las personas imaginan inmediatamente catedrales, monasterios, sinagogas, mezquitas y tesoros arquitectónicos, ¿sí? Pero hoy hemos recordado que los manuscritos, los textos sagrados y el conocimiento espiritual forman también parte esencial de ese legado. Son, en cierto modo, el alma detrás de las piedras, que ahora seguro que va a decir algo sobre esto del alma detrás de las piedras. En este sentido más amplio, ¿cómo podemos garantizar que el patrimonio religioso y bibliográfico de Europa, desde las obras cristianas como el libro de Beato de Liébana y el libro de Kells, hasta las valiosas tradiciones judías de escritura e iluminación que también han dado forma e identidad cultural del continente europeo, siga siendo accesible, significativo e inspirador para las generaciones futuras? ¿Podría esta dimensión religiosa, interreligiosa, compartida a través de los libros, del arte y el conocimiento, convertirse quizás en un puente de diálogo y entendimiento mutuo en la Europa de hoy, que se está secularizando cada vez más? Este es el lance por el que estamos todas estas personas aquí y por las que están ustedes aquí también y los que están fuera. I don't know if you would rather have me reading in English again the question.
Yes.
Yeah?
That would be
Yeah?
helpful.
Okay.
Only the question.
Okay, you see, Beato always said that nobody needs anybody to understand. Que nadie necesite de otro para entender. Estamos en el siglo XXI y tenemos que... So, for the future of Europe's religious and bibliographical heritage. When we think of religious heritage, most people immediately picture cathedrals, monasteries, synagogues, mosques, and architectural treasures. But today, we have been reminded that manuscripts, sacred texts, and spiritual knowledge are equally part of our legacy. They are the soul behind the stones. So in this broader sense, how can we ensure that Europe's religious and bibliographical heritage, from Christian works such as the Beato of Liébana and the Book of Kells, to the invaluable Jewish scriptural and illuminated traditions have also shaped our continent's cultural identity, remains accessible, meaningful, and inspiring for future generations? Could this interreligious dimension shared through books, art, and knowledge become a bridge for dialogue and mutual understanding in today's Europe, mostly when Europe is becoming more and more secular? This is the thing. I know Professor Longi had already shared some ideas about
Yes, I didn't expect to be the first.
No.
Okay.
Well, it's up to you if somebody wants
But
to.
I'm prepared.
Okay.
However, now, after I read your question, I understood your question, and the topic of this debate, I decided to begin with an autobiographical memory, if I can. Because even if I had a Christian education, a Catholic education, the very first time I read the text of Apocalypse and I studied it, it was during the classes of history of medieval town that my professor, Claudio Bonardi, and other professors like Enrico Guidoni held when I was a student. Because the final chapters of Apocalypse describe Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, a spiritual Jerusalem, but their visual impact on the imaginary of European builders and city managers, which could call like this, was very strong. And so the first reaction to the topic of this conference is, I don't know if the English translation is correct, the transcalarity. I mean, a jump of scale we need to work on different scale. We are experts on text, on visual art, on architecture, city planning, but this difference of scale, of dimension, is just, I think, a technical, a practical division, but the meaning of the places is in something that is cross scales, different dimension of art, because the life of communities, the life of intellectual was not per specific sector, just drawing, just painting, just building. But there was a meaning of every action of the community. And so when we work on religious heritage, like everybody, we usually reproduce our specialism in university or in national bureau, and we lose the sense of what we do. Because I'm specialist in 13th century drawings, me especially in 15th century domes. But the deep meaning, we risk to lose it. So I think that this morning we had really an extraordinary opportunity to go through an archetype of visual strongness of the connections. And so I think that the main message I would like to share with you, to think about religious heritage in terms of urban religious heritage, because the links between each monument, each altar, each masterpiece is in an urban tissue of relations. I think of the illumination about the square Jerusalem, the round Jerusalem in the Beatus, the way, the doors. So we're talking about cities that are, meanwhile, with projections outside the town, also town to be accessible with a perimeter, but it's a perimeter without many doors, and each door has its own meaning, his color, his specific saint, and so we have to think about the part of the cities like a part of a global interpretation. Also, for example, when we have a representation, I hope to be right, I ask, with some representation with the virtues. So there is also an ethical representation of this Jerusalem that was also a strong basis for the ethical interpretation of civic laws, civic rules, civic planning. So I hope that this possibility to interpret the town like a space of spiritualities as a whole could help us also to go over the differences. I mean, to respect difference, but to consider a shared common space in our towns, to find places of perimeters, but also of going through perimeters. This was my first impression when we were invited here to share our experiences.
Thank you very much. Anybody want to say something? Does it work? Yes. Yes, it works. Okay. Well, it was very pleased to be here and to listen to these important speeches, which were inspiring today. But I just have some thoughts to the question: to ensure the Europe's religious and bibliographical heritage remains accessible, was your question. meaningful and inspiring for future generations. I think there are many different actions to be taken. We should use, in this digital era, technological tools for innovation, fostering social innovation and strengthening skills in the field of cultural heritage as a whole, but in the section of religious and bibliographical heritage specifically. So capitalize on technical tools to make sure that there is enough information, especially now in the era of AI, where you just type a question, AI searches the internet, and it probably doesn't find any, at least I was not aware, I am not a scientist of course, but there is so much knowledge going around, which is now, specifically on this, I have never ever found, for instance, these two books together.
No.
No. So I think that would be very important. So there is preserving and curating, of course, because you explained very clearly that these are very specific items that there is not so much left anymore and accessible only to a few people probably. So we were very lucky today. So the other hand is, I think, so there is a need for this research, but also to translate it into digital accessibility. And the importance of cooperation and collaboration is among stakeholders. This could be done, for instance, through FRH as a network, because we are a European-wide and beyond even. We can bring these people together as we do today. We are the keepers of the collective European memory, and we are responsible for that. The other thing is, touching upon what my colleague said, it is very important to engage local communities. In participatory and inclusive processes that recognize the importance of cultural heritage and this specific heritage in fostering social cohesion and integration. So there should be more dialogue, more debate. But the first thing for dialogue is knowledge. So we first should open up the knowledge. Strengthening skills and propose measures to support training and capacity building on this. So maybe we should talk with the EU, that, because today was very inspirational for me, that there is this common grounds, especially as what my colleague said, flip to what we have in common instead of
the differences.
But then first you need to know what we have in common. And so I think this is, raising an awareness and spreading knowledge. I think these are very different points, but where you can take very easy actions already by working together, I guess.
Thank
you. I'm happy to go next.
Yes, please.
So I was thinking about Manuel this morning, and I thought that was a great example of how we can reinterpret the past and learn from the past and enrich our present lives through understanding what these what the religious heritage stood for and the meanings, and to try and find a bridge to the past that we can then bring it into our presence, which in some ways is a challenge because, as you said, you talked about growing secularization, of course, with growing diversity within Europe. And it's quite interesting because in some ways, of course, places of worship and religious heritage is fundamentally parochial. It is fundamentally narrow. It's linked to a specific religious tradition, and yet it's also shared heritage. So Beato is the heritage of Potes, it's the heritage of Spain, it's the heritage of Europe, and it's for all Europeans. But how each person comes to it and what they see in it will, of course, be very different. But that can be enriching, and thinking about, you were saying about could interreligious dimension become a bridge for dialogue and mutual understanding. I would also add to that a way of mutual enrichment that we can benefit because people come from different perspectives, they see different things, and in that conversation, in the differences, we then grow. And we know, and I remember, being a particular event where, the point was made that cultures develop through encounters with other cultures. So if a culture is sealed, it doesn't grow, it withers and it dies. So that encounter is what keeps cultures alive and growing and developing. So I think that's, obviously a very important aspect of this. And kind of linked to that, I was just thinking about, when we look at art, we think about how art continues to live on with each person that goes into the art gallery and sees a painting for the very first time. That encounter with the image is a form of renewal, right? It's a form, it's something new has happened, which hasn't happened before, with that particular person encountering and the experience that person has, and that experience is a sign of this living culture, this living thing. And I think, of course, that also very much applies when we're talking about religious heritage, what the nature of that encounter and what each person brings and what they learn from that encounter. I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Well, we're going in a row. We're sitting in a row, so
think-
I
I think you should introduce them and introduce you too, because
Yeah,
we didn't
okay.
say to anybody
Okay.
who we are. Since we know each other, como nos conocemos, no.
I actually thought it was Scottish people first.
Without borders.
You cannot do
without
that,
borders.
Michael. You cannot do that. So please do the presentations of Lilian and the country.
Lilian, member of the advisory board of FRH.
Lilian es miembro del Consejo Asesor de FRH.
Andrea Longhi,
Presidenta del Consejo Asesor de FRH.
Oh,
Sí, perdón.
Okay, pardon. I'm new, sorry. Sort of new. Presidenta.
Perfecto español.
Presidenta.
Perfecto español, ya.
Del welke committee?
Consejo
Consejo
Asesor.
Asesor.
Advisory Asesor.
Assessor. Okay.
Perfecto.
Perfecto.
¿sí? Perfecto.
Trying. Michael Mail,
Of the Governance Committee.
presidente de la Fundación del Patrimonio de Judío
En Europa.
en Europa.
And a board member of FRH.
And a board member of FRH.
Y miembro del
So that's also
Consejo
very
de FRH.
important.
Y Andrea, Andrea
Okay.
también.
Okay. And then I hand over to you. Yeah. I'm Patty Waitman. I'm
¿Eh? Sí,
Sorry?
Andrea, you have to say Andrea as well, because you mentioned him, but
Yeah.
you didn't explain.
what? Sorry.
Andrea Longhi.
Andrea Longhi. Oh, and in English or what?
Sí, in English is okay.
Okay.
In English
He's
is
the
okay.
president of, I forgot already.
He's a professor.
Professor. Oh, sorry. You're a professor, I don't know,
Should ask them
of the
themselves.
urban, what was it? Urban.
Yeah, it's better. Yeah, each
Yeah.
one. Sí, each one.
Professor of
Yeah, it's okay.
Architectural History in Politecnico di Torino.
Sí, el profesor Andrea Longhi viene de la Universidad Politécnica de Turín.
Okay, and my name is Patty Waitman. I'm director of Groninger Churches. So that's how you pronounce
es
it.
Groningen Churches,
Yeah,
muy
and
bien.
a member of the executive committee.
Committee.
Okay. I'll leave it at that.
Vale.
And I was thinking about what Justin was saying, to flip the perspective, because we can talk about how people should study, and I thought Professor Castañeras mentioned it very well, to take it into the situation of today. So when you look at images from the past, you see how it inspires the situation of today, in art, whether they be artists, graphic designers, or what. And I think by giving also the floor to young people is a good way to preserve our religious heritage for the future. And that's why we existing as an association. But I think it's very important to give the floor to other people in a way as well, because, for example, what we do in Groningen, for example, we hand over churches to the local communities back, because our churches are sort of secular became secular, and we reused the churches.
Like this one.
Like this one. And we use it for activities, like here. But we use them for cultural activities. So, because if you use them for cultural activities, for example, Justin showed the Church of Holwierde, and we're doing something very exciting, which is giving that church, which is a medieval church, it's a state monument, and we decided to give that back to the youth of the environment where this church is based. So you talk to the local people, and they are first a bit afraid, but you can't do anything. But it is, we do this because we want the keepers of the future to be interested in what they organize in these churches and how you can involve young people into this religious heritage. And you could do, for example, spoken word, if you talk about bibliography. I mean, if you do spoken word, you still use a sort of immaterial heritage, but you use it in your own way. So I would say flip the perspective and use, for example, Beato or Book of Kells as a source of inspiration, for the future. That's one of the things I would like to say.
Perfecto, thank you. En mi caso, antes de pasar a Chiara, bueno, Patti forma parte también del Consejo de FRH. En mi caso, primero, si alguna persona necesita una traducción de inglés a español, que nos lo haga saber, por favor, si alguien ve que lo necesita. Retomando lo que ha dicho Patti, en mi caso, lo he visto perfectamente. Este joven diseñador gráfico que hemos tenido aquí hace un momento, que es el creador de esta imagen, la accesibilidad de todo este contenido es algo que nos concierne a todos, porque él ha creado esto una vez ha sido expuesto a las imágenes de Beato, mucho más, y a las imágenes del Book of Kells. Y él ha podido producir esto, y más que va a producir, porque va a haber un antes y un después en él. Y como él, otros. Es la generación que viene que ya está metiéndose realmente en esta transmisión. So in English, more or less, I'm saying that we are doing it right now. We are sitting here, we are discussing here, but then this young graphic designer that we hired... Oh, sorry. Sí, pero ellos no tienen... Sí, vale. Vale, ok. No necesito traducir, perfecto. Vale, pues entonces lo dejamos aquí. Dejamos aquí esto, que es una cosa continua. O sea, normalmente es un heritage, es un patrimonio que tenemos que conseguir hacerlo mucho más accesible. Tendremos que buscar, como decía Lilian, cómo facilitarlo, ahora que hay nuevas tecnologías, para que toda esta juventud tenga ese acceso para esa confrontación de imágenes, de ese conocimiento que estábamos diciendo antes, y que ellos puedan después crear y devolvernos esto, no para nosotros, porque nosotros trabajamos para ellos, pero es que ellos ya tienen que estar trabajando para los que vienen después.
And could I just then close to something, because you talked about the designer. It just struck me that I have been working in branding companies. Images are the most strong branding that anybody can have. And today it was shown, the last speaker said, that Beato once said, nobody needs anybody to understand. So an image can be understood by anybody. And as we have so many images in these books, we should really use them to bring them across, because every image on its own is already a very strong message. The only thing is that we don't understand this message. It should not be only the religious message, like you also explained. You are not a theologist. You just look at the messages that has been conveyed and the pictures. So I think we have this big treasure of all these images produced. And so, that's just that I was talking, because you talked about young designer, and then it suddenly crossed my mind.
Yeah.
So the treasure is already there.
The treasure is already there.
We just have to give it a lot of exposure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hola,
Sí.
buenas tardes. Me llamo Chiara Curti. Quizás la cosa que justamente estaba comentando Lilian, ¿no? Sobre la fuerza de la imagen, lo que sorprende, ¿no? Hoy estamos todos aquí, cada uno con su formación, y todos hemos quedado prendados, ¿no? Por estas imágenes que son casi futuristas en un aspecto, o sea, son realmente modernísimas, ¿no? A pesar que no son para nada modernas, pero sí, como decía también el profesor Longhi, quizás logran tener esta síntesis, ¿no? Como un poco el reclamo que hacía, esta de ir a la esencia. Entonces, hablando de la esencia, finalmente, de esta visión cósmica esencial del origen, ¿no? de la razón del hombre, de descubrir cuál es el propósito, ¿no? que tiene el universo, o sea, porque él está aquí, pues es el cómo, ¿no? el Beato pudo tener este impacto que no se queda en una superficie, no ofrece únicamente una decoración, ¿no? sino que realmente va a la esencia del hombre, de su por qué vive, por qué está aquí, cuál es su relación con el resto del cosmos, de la vida, así, ¿no? Y creo que esto, justamente por eso, después cualquier otra ciencia, cualquier otro hombre quiso en su propósito transformarlo en otras artes, ¿no? De hecho, las catedrales pues se basan bastante sobre, o sea, cogen inspiración de estos beatos para poderse crear, ¿no? Y efectivamente, si vemos las catedrales como se construyen no tanto como la genialidad de uno, sino como una sociedad, ¿no? Una sociedad de la cual, que también esto se comentaba, una sociedad en la cual participan pues personas que no solamente son del lugar, o sea, también se llaman maestros de otros sitios, se llaman personas de todas las artes y también personas que no tienen ninguna arte. O sea, la cosa que es muy sorprendente de esta sociedad que se crea alrededor de las catedrales es que cada uno da lo mejor de sí, ¿no? Pero sin necesidad que tú sea el mejor. O sea, y el hecho también de la economía con la cual se fomenta esta manera de construir, que básicamente una economía expiatoria, o sea, una economía donde cada uno a través de una limosna va construyendo, hace que todos sean partícipes, ninguno sea un propietario particular, sino que haya esta forma de construir que no pertenece a nadie, porque finalmente la limosna es algo irregular, tú no puedes prever que hoy tengas mucho, mañana poco, o sea, no puedes saberlo. Entonces es un ritmo que prescinde totalmente de la voluntad del constructor, sino que luego puede seguir. Yo creo que esta fascinación, ¿no? de no tener en tus manos algo que estás construyendo tú, el vértigo, ¿no? También el mismo vértigo de la vida. Nosotros no podemos decidir si mañana vivimos, morimos así. Y creo que esto también es lo que hace que las catedrales sean todavía esta imagen, ¿no? Yo hice como sobre lo que preguntaba Pilar, ¿no? de la contemporaneidad. Hice un pequeño estudio, ¿no? en un momento, porque bueno, trabajo bastante con Sagrada Familia, con el Templo de la Sagrada Familia Barcelona, y claro, muchas veces surge la pregunta, ¿no? porque viene gente de todo el mundo. Pues es un templo católico y al contrario todo el mundo dice algo, ¿no? Está atraído, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué es lo que atrae tanto? No sé, bueno, como un ejercicio personal empecé a seguir a todos los influencers que han entrado aquel año en Sagrada Familia. Pues la verdad que la finalidad de mantener la imagen de hoy, ¿no? que Instagram, que es la nueva imagen, pues la finalidad de todas estas personas normalmente es la de vender algo, ¿no? O vender un contenido, o vender unos productos concretos. Y en el caso de entrar en Sagrada Familia sí que el registro siempre cambiaba. Ya no intentaban vender nada, o sea, no se utilizaba el espacio para una publicidad de alguna otra cosa, sino que todo transmitían un concepto espiritual. Entonces, a mí ya me ha llamado bastante la atención porque sí que a través de esta capacidad, ¿no? que también Gaudí, imitando las catedrales, la construcción de catedrales, intentó devolver esta mirada simbólica hacia un cosmos, o sea, cómo se construye una catedral que finalmente una floresta de columnas, o sea, él lo que propone es que esta floresta de columnas pues sea explícita. Estos son árboles, ¿no? Entonces, el hombre medieval cuando entraba en una catedral sí que veía un bosque. Hoy nosotros vemos columnas porque somos incapaces de hacer esta traslación trascendental, ¿no? Nosotros vemos todo tal cual como es. Entonces, Gaudí lo que hace es devolver esta mirada que es ligada a la contemplación también al hombre contemporáneo y tiene un efecto, ¿no? Tiene un efecto sobre estas personas que, sin saber quién son sus seguidores y que normalmente es esto, se esperan como nada, el contenido normal que ellos hacen, pues repentinamente cambia registro. A mí me impactó mucho porque algunos hasta hablando con una terminología de Dios, no sé qué. Y la cosa que también me llamó bastante la atención es como, siendo que las palabras no alcanzan, y yo creo que es este el tema de hacer unos libros ilustrados, o sea, la palabra es limitada, o sea, nosotros muchas veces no sabemos declarar un amor así, necesitamos de otro registro que la poesía. Entonces también estos influencers en un momento introducían como una forma poética de hablar, ¿no? Y claro, siendo que no podía alcanzar la palabra, es lo que pasa también con esto, el Apocalipsis, ¿no? Dice cosas que son, lo decía también, inalcanzables, o sea que uno dice, bueno, casi encriptada, ¿no? Y al final esto también se va al contrario, ¿no? Yo no puedo hablar con mis propias palabras, no puedo explicarlo y voy, entonces voy a la imagen y voy a la poesía, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, un poco era esto, ¿no? A ver si, o sea que estos, yo creo que no es una cuestión, no para darte la contra, no, pero de jóvenes, no jóvenes, es una cuestión de ser hombres. O sea, en el momento que uno busca la humanidad profunda de uno, pues en la seriedad, ¿no? En el hundir en una cuestión que es espiritual, que finalmente es esencial, pues el resultado es esta sensibilidad, ¿no? que permite. Entonces yo creo que casi un ejercicio a introducir el tiempo y la sensibilidad que van de la mano, ¿no? Dentro de la vida, que de hecho también el entrar en una iglesia es suspender, ¿no? En un momento el tiempo como que se dilata, la espiritualidad necesita del tiempo, ¿no? No puede decir, vale, ahora estoy rezo 27 segundos, hago como si fuera un ejercicio de gimnasia física, ¿no? Y al contrario, esto yo creo que la fuerza, ¿no? que tenemos de este patrimonio que se desarrolló en el tiempo, y de hecho es muy bonito que se haya reproducido, ¿no? Que hoy lo explicaban también. O sea, que haya estas reproducciones que son iguales, pero no son iguales, o sea, que no haya, sí, que no crean un problema, o sea, no es que la reproducción sea, o sea, que realmente como natural, ¿no? Este poder fluir en el tiempo, adaptarse en los tiempos y hablar a cada tiempo, pero que en realidad lo que queda, ¿no? es el educar a esta sensibilidad.
Gracias.
So thank you. My name is Justin Krusen. I've been introduced before, professor in Bergen, in Norway, and also a member of the Council of FRH. Thank you for the question, Pilar. Very interesting, and I've been listening to what everybody has been saying, and I think a lot of interesting, very important points have already been made. One, of course, is the fact that we need knowledge. It starts with knowledge, and we have to keep our role, especially as universities and schools and everybody. So we have to keep spreading the word, giving lectures, developing courses, make educational experiences everywhere. So we just keep doing what we are already doing, but knowledge is very central to everything that we are aiming for. I think especially with religious heritage, it's also the religious aspect is actually a great conversation starter always, because religions are about the basic questions of life. It's about what sense does it all have, and where do we come from, where do we go, and everything. So I think, and if you look at all the religions and put them together, the basic questions are always the same. The answers are different. They're also the same, but they're slightly different. The words they use are different, but the underlying questions are the same. So that is always a good conversation starter. I think there's more that they have in common than that separates them. But I think we should also look beyond the religious realm And even if we're speaking about churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples and whatever, we're speaking about public spaces that people have always used as if it was their living room in a village or in a town or a thing. So without forgetting about the religious realm, we can step out of it and put the emphasis on how churches have always, say churches, but it's religious sites and heritage sites in general, have always brought people together on very central moments in life, when there was something to celebrate, or there was something to mourn, or there was something to whatever, to come together and talk about things, and to create this common ground. And I think, looking at the world we're living in now, I think we are losing a lot of common ground. We don't have common public spaces in villages and towns as it was even not long ago. A couple of generations ago, grew up in their houses and in their families, but also in the church or whatever, in the synagogues, where they had community life. So you had your own individual, you had your family life and your friends, and then there was the community. And that community aspect is crumbling in many places, and that's making people very isolated. And if we use the religious sites, I think in their full, if we understand them and educate everybody what they are really about, and try to recuperate that as long as we can even make ourselves happier, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure too.
That's it.
See? Okay. See?
May I add something to what you said? Because I think on the one hand, the churches are sort of not full anymore, and you use them for different, step out of the religious idea in a way. But on the other hand, people are searching for the spiritual. I was thinking of the Camino de Liébana,
we are aligned.
but also, and I think that is a way to find connection with another generation, because, for example, well, we talked about it in another gremium, but in Holland we've organized the Ziltepad, which is coming out of nowhere. It was not a Camino, but we made a Camino. And a lot of young people are walking that because they are looking for peacefulness. They're looking, so what you say, Houston, is also, there is common ground, only we need to find it back. And I think in that sense, people are searching. And it doesn't have to be the religious way we used to practice it, but I think people are searching. And I think that's a very positive thing. That's what I want to say.
Could I quickly add to a common ground? That a common ground is, as our former president said, Olivier Drouin, art and beauty is a common ground. It is a language that speaks to everybody. Yeah. And if you look at these Beatos and at the book of Kells, it's really beautiful. So this is a way to bring this message across. That's a common ground. And these images, they are really amazing. So we should really use them as a meeting place, maybe in a digital world, to talk about or to exchange the knowledge about this, because this is beauty from the past, which will help create the beauty from the future.
And I'll just quickly add, because I was thinking they reflect our kind of common humanity, because they relate to the big issues in life, what we're all, but maybe the distinction is in today's world, it's around the questions as opposed to providing the answers. And maybe that's the key difference.
Stefan?
Yeah, I think you heard a lot of general answers about this question, and that's why I don't want to give once more of such a general answer. I only want to point out of several entrances for several people. We are so diverse, like the world is diverse, and everybody needs an own entrance for understanding this world, to live with this world. And maybe Gaudi found his answer to create such a cathedral, or other examples. I met her here in the auditory, two people who find her own way to give the past a new future with novels. I think it's a great example also
as
to
well.
have it. I learned last week in a monastery in Germany the connection between the word of Harry Potter with the word of a monastery. I found it was amazing how connected is it. And I want to point out on another example we participated with FRH, with the inter-religious choir. It will be built up this year, so that next year we have concerts in whole Europe with the choir of Protestant Church, of Catholic Church, of Judaism, I don't know how to say, Judaism is okay, and with Muslimic elements. And it's also an entrance to come into the world of the religions. And I think the world is so diverse and everybody needs its own entrance. And that's why we need so much creativity for all these entrances. And I would like to invite you all to find your entrance and to give it to other people.
Thank you. Yeah. Sarah?
Hello, my name is Sarah de Longzin, and I live in France. I am a board member of 3 heritage associations, one the largest historical heritage, the Music Board of Notre Dame of Paris, and French Heritage, which is an American-French association. And I mention them because all 3 have very active children programs, and I think that's very, very important to be able to continue to have people who will grow up and become incredible researchers, academics, etc. in this field, but also because they integrate in that way religious heritage. I think it's very interesting. We heard the anecdote from Andrea about his experience in youth with the apocalypse. I also heard last night about how a passion for medieval art was born from visits with the grandparents, a grandfather. And so we mustn't forget the importance that through books, through art, through all this, these themes, that we reach out and actively include children. And I will just mention 2 programs which have been very successful. One is, and I will say, I think it's interesting that in various countries, the section of the government that deals with this is Consejería de Cultura, Turismo y Deporte. And these are themes that work really well with children to combine them all together, culture, sport, and tourism. And I say that we had one program in one of these heritage associations, which was worked out with the Ministry of Education in France for children between the ages of 8 and 12, with a competition, a yearly competition on a theme dealing with heritage. And so there would be a year where they would find their heritage, and most often it was religious, because as we all know, religious heritage tends to be 500 feet away, and make a film about it, or write a book about it, and these are very important ways of integrating heritage. And the other experience, which I say because we also have to think like the future, and the future is these children. We had a program with one of the other associations where we went to a school in the Saint-Denis area of France, right outside of Paris, heavily populated by immigrants, especially from North Africa, the site of the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, so major religious heritage. Also the site of the Stade de France, which maybe you don't know, but is major soccer heritage, so very important. And the school, which was a public school, was given the project to create and write about their favorite heritage around them. And amazingly, this was not directed towards religious heritage, but amazingly, they chose the cathedral and the Stade de France. And they wrote an incredible novel about those two heritage pieces together. And I thought it was very interesting. Again, children, youth looks at heritage corresponding to their generation, and we need to be more attuned to that to be able to pass on our art in our books. And so I can just see so much that could be done with the Beatos, with the book of Kells. I'm going back to France and starting to work on it right now.
Thank you. Sí, espera, le paso yo. Gracias.
Bueno, primero quiero decir, ellos no pueden tener la traducción.
Ellos no pueden. We can't understand.
Bueno, primero quiero decir que la semana pasada, por circunstancias, estaba en Polonia discutiendo en un foro sobre si el camino de Santiago era todavía religioso. Y me sorprendió porque había una investigadora de Eslovenia que nos presentó un estudio que ella hizo, ella es una socióloga, sobre las motivaciones de las personas que van a Santiago de Compostela. Hizo como una cata de estas que hacen los sociólogos. Y lo sorprendente, precisamente, era, alguien lo ha dicho hoy aquí, que la gente no lo hace 50% por motivos religiosos, pero lo hace 80% por un sentido, digamos, espiritual, trascendente, ¿no? Entonces eso, bueno, es muy interesante y en relación a lo que yo he vivido hoy, tengo que decir que la primera cosa que tengo que decir es una felicitación a este Consejo del futuro de la herencia religiosa en Europa por el alto nivel, porque es difícil, y estoy pensando en donde estuve la semana pasada, que haya este nivel de discurso. Creo que el nivel de discurso que vosotros habéis tenido hoy es increíble, de cómo se puede reconducir o cómo podemos pensar en esta herencia religiosa europea, que al final es una herencia compartida, ¿no? Entonces a mí se me ocurrían, mientras hablabais, 3 puntos a partir de la pregunta de Pilar. Un primer punto, para que se entienda que los manuscritos y los textos sagrados están ahí y que están detrás de todos estos monumentos y monasterios. Claro, el monasterio está vacío, pero tiene un sentido porque tenía estos textos, y estamos aquí porque había este texto ahí arriba. Es el tema accesible. Afortunadamente ahora vivimos en una sociedad en la cual, si tú vas a la Biblioteca Vaticana digitalmente, te puedes bajar muchísimos manuscritos, que esto hace 30 años era imposible. Pero claro, eso es un repositorio. Entonces, lo que tú decías del conocimiento, o sea, tú puedes tener muchas imágenes, pero necesitas el conocimiento. Y el gran reto, que vosotros habéis hablado también, es el reto de cómo se transmite esto. Todos nosotros hemos nacido en una sociedad donde había una educación muy basada en la religión o la historia de la religión, aunque sea en un país laico, pero había este conocimiento. Hoy en día vivimos en una sociedad donde, claro, nuestros jóvenes carecen muchas veces de este puente, ¿no? Entonces, por esto creo que tenemos que hacer un esfuerzo, pero hay un peligro en esto, que tenemos que hacerlo atractivo, lo tenemos que hacer comprensible, lo tenemos que acercar, sea a través de estos encuentros, sea a través de una exposición, sea a través de a lo mejor un discurso muy culto, poder cambiar el registro y acercarlo de otra forma, ¿no? Que es lo que yo intenté hacer en la primera parte de la conferencia, decir, bueno, el Apocalipsis es, madre mía, pero a ver, que es más cercano de lo que la gente piensa. Pero hay un peligro en todo eso. Y yo lo he visto, por ejemplo, en Barcelona, resulta que el Museo Nacional de Arte de Cataluña contrató un Instagramer, y espero que no me estéis escuchando. O sea, a mí me daba vergüenza escucharlo, para promocionar la colección de arte medieval que no tiene visitantes. Pero es que eran, ¿sabes? Como este tiene cara de este político, ¿sabes? O sea, cuidado, porque aquí hay y por eso lo del conocimiento es tan importante, que creo que la función nuestra es decir, vale, lo queremos transmitir y queremos hacerlo accesible y queremos que esto se conozca, pero no vaciarlo de contenido, que es el problema de la sociedad actual y de quien nos paga muchas veces, que nos quiere obligar a vaciar las cosas de contenido. Y yo después creo también, y esto es a raíz de la profesora de germanística, ¿no?, que creo que otra cosa que es muy importante en la Europa de hoy, que ya no es toda blanca ni es toda cristiana, es tener esta capacidad de lo transcultural, ¿no?, de cómo podemos pensar también en esta cosa transcultural, ¿no? Y yo creo que lo bonito, y yo os voy a leer una historia, claro, los manuscritos son historia. A ver si no se me ha ido. Y solo la historia de un manuscrito es la historia de Europa, ¿no? El Haggadah de Sarajevo, ¿sabéis la historia? Es un valioso manuscrito sefardí que fue producido en Barcelona alrededor de 1350 y ha viajado a través del tiempo, sobreviviendo en la antigua Yugoslavia, y ahora está exhibido en el Museo Nacional de Bosnia y Herzegovina. Contiene un texto tradicional, que es el Haggadah, que narra la historia del éxodo de Egipto, con ilustraciones de escenas bíblicas. Y sabéis que esto huye de Barcelona con los pogroms, llega por toda una serie de historias a Sarajevo, y durante la guerra de Yugoslavia se creyó que había sido destruido. Lo sabéis la historia. Y finalmente se supo que se había escondido, y ahora es la joya de la corona, ¿no? Entonces, solo la historia de un manuscrito nos puede hablar tanto de la historia de Europa y también de lo importante que es preservar ese material, creo. Entonces, solo esas historias cualquiera las entiende, ¿no? Y yo creo que detrás de toda esa tradición hay unas historias sorprendentes.
Impresionante.
Yo quería preguntar una cosa al profesor Manuel, porque cuando yo miro, por ejemplo, las personas de las catedrales, yo creo que la fuerza que han tenido las imágenes ha sido justamente el hecho que no había intermediario. O sea, la persona mira, tú cuando miras no tienes el guía al lado que te dice, mira, esto es esto, este es el otro. O sea, pero una persona cada vez que vuelve, pues tiene un entendimiento distinto, ¿no? O sea, vas por capas. Entonces yo creo que quizás el error, ¿no?, es una hipótesis, ¿no?, pero que hemos hecho es justamente esto, quererlo explicar. Entonces, quitar este misterio de esto inaccesible que repentinamente se hace accesible en un detalle, y este detalle se hace llave para poder interpretar todo el resto, y en el tiempo que la comprensión sea más profunda, ¿no? Porque si yo, no lo sé, pero si yo en principio desvelo, ¿no?, todo a mi medida, como este Instagramer, bueno, no quedamos aquí, entonces yo luego salgo de ahí que ya le he dado como checklist, ya le he visto, ¿no? Y al contrario, creo que este tipo, ¿no?, del patrimonio religioso, lo que la imagen, ¿no?, es este volver, ¿no?, siempre volver. Entonces hay como una comprensión que se da también en el tiempo, que no es instantánea y que pretende que sea gradual, ¿no? Es como una iniciación, digamos, no lo sé, pero creo que se podría volver a esta manera, ¿no?, de aprender las cosas en el tiempo, antes de
crear este checklist de he visto esto, he visto lo otro, ya he visto, porque, por ejemplo, también esto en Sagrada Familia se ha hecho para controlar el aforo, ¿no? Cuánto tiempo uno se queda en Sagrada Familia, ¿no? Entonces, también para controlar la guía, cuánto debía durar, bueno, en fin. Y se ha visto que hay varias personas que entran para segundos. O sea, Sagrada Familia tiene 30 euros para entrar, o sea, y entran y salen, porque en realidad lo que hacen es una fotografía, ¿no? Entonces, se hacen un selfie y se van, ¿no? Entonces, esto, claro, es esta mentalidad que se ha perdido del aprendizaje. O sea, más que dar una información, yo creo que hay que devolver la capacidad de poder aprender cómo se aprende, no tanto qué se aprende, no sé, como hipótesis, ¿no?
Sí. Professor Mihan?
Can I be heard? Yeah, I can. I just want to say something very briefly and to turn the question on its head a little bit. I think there's widespread public interest, and I can talk only for Britain and Ireland, but there's widespread public interest in things of the past and in cultural matters, and all you have to do is look at the extraordinary success of programs about art or about archaeology. You know, people talk about this, but one of the difficulties is that certainly in England, I believe that history has been dropped from the school curriculum as an essential core subject, and that's criminal. You know, it's a really, almost literally, it's a weapon of fascism. You know, to do something like this, and. I think that's very serious, and it tells against all the efforts of you guys and everybody else, I think, in the long term. But the other thing is that programs like that are successful, and within the background, the fact that people aren't learning the basis of things at school into the near future, there's a belief that the body of knowledge that we have is static, and there isn't a wide enough realization that no subject, you know, and we'll take just the two subjects here, or the three subjects that we've heard about today here, you know, the church furniture, the Beatus, and the Book of Kells. There's no static body of knowledge there. It relies, for the subjects to live, they rely on research. And the kind of things that people were reading about the Book of Kells in the 30s, 40s, 50s, you know, even up to the 1970s, are quite discredited now in all sorts of ways. And that relies on research, it relies on funding. And in my experience, you know, even to get across within universities that there's a need to fund research in these kind of subjects, isn't that straightforward?
Yeah. It's true. I entirely agree.
And may I say, as well, in Ireland, there was a move to drop history as a core subject, and that move was defeated. So in Ireland, everybody's still learning history.
But you touch upon something very specific, like I'm a member of the Cultural Heritage Expert Board of Europe, and expert group to advise the Commission. But as in every country, culture and education are in the last part that get the money. Yeah. They have to struggle. We have been writing a paper towards an integrated approach, because culture is everywhere and is connected with everything, and heritage is too. But there are only 8 countries in Europe that really actively support this subject, and we are 27. So the others, they just pick economy, business, you know, whatever. Of course, everybody supports climate change, but in all of these subjects, culture and cultural heritage can be very meaningful. Because, for instance, and so we are gathering I don't know the word. We are gathering examples all the time to talk with all these different other commissioners to be able, our commissioner, Commissioner McLaniff, he's very young. He's the youngest commissioner amongst all of them. And when we had to face, after the elections, this new world that is going on because the entire world is changing. He was the only one of all the commissioners in the room that said, look, we should not all only be sad. We have our identity, we have our culture, it combines us, it gives us a common strength, and maybe we should look more into that and go more into depth on these subjects. So I entirely agree with you. So we are fighting in the top with all of us together. FRH is one of the organizations represented there, to push this integrated approach, because that's the only way that will survive. Because as we talked about AI and everything, it is static knowledge. We have to produce new knowledge in order to add to it. And I think this is for all of you to ask. It is very good that you are all here, because we are the ones who need to bring this further. It will not go further on its own. If we do not do anything, it will be even less and less and less. While there is a treasure of knowledge there, and it can be very, very meaningful for society. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Al hilo de todo lo que se está diciendo aquí, de la transmisión hacia los jóvenes, yo quisiera transmitirles a ustedes una preocupación que me ronda hace tiempo. Todos estamos de acuerdo en que la idiosincrasia de Europa, la cultura de nuestra civilización, se basa en la cristiandad y en la cultura judio-cristiana. Y, sin embargo, estamos asistiendo a una secularización constante y en aumento de nuestro mundo. Se han promulgado leyes civiles de forma casi simultánea por toda Europa para instaurar la laicidad, y esto deja paso a que otras religiones que no están tan por la labor de la laicidad, religiones que no son tan individualistas como el cristianismo, hablo en concreto del islamismo, cuya religiosidad está tan ligada a su código civil que no será fácil que los islamistas acepten que en los países en que habitan se imponga la misma laicidad también para ellos, igual que para los cristianos y para los judíos. En mi opinión, estamos asistiendo a una islamización de países que históricamente han sido el corazón de Europa, y quisiera saber qué opinión tienen ustedes al respecto del futuro de nuestra cultura. Mi pregunta no se refiere solamente al patrimonio artístico del que estamos hablando y sobre el que todos los que estamos aquí estamos enamorados, sino a la esencia de nuestra civilización. Y ya, por dar un dato, me ha llamado mucho la atención el ponente que participa en un coro intercultural e interreligioso. Me pregunto si en ese coro hay musulmanes, porque me gustaría creer que también participan en la interculturalidad de los países europeos.
Could I present from the Cyprus group? Because the Cyprus group was together last week. It's a working group. We have many working groups in FRH. There's a very important member, Tariq Hussain. He is a travel writer on Islamic heritage. And there is also this common ground. He produced papers from Cyprus and research from all over the world that we need to find this common ground because it is there, and it is similar like with the Beato and with everything, it is not spread. Some people misuse certain heritage also to bring their own message across, and this polarizes things. But if you look very good, there is a common ground to be found. So it is, well, I don't know what you wanted to say, Justin, but I know that FRH is also working on these subjects because we are an interreligious, we are not a religious organization. We are about heritage, and all types of heritage background, all kinds of religious heritage is welcome.
In Europe.
Exactly. Yeah.
I must say I feel a bit uncomfortable with the question, because the question is really about we were here and then they came and then we have a problem. It's not about that. FRH is about finding a future for everybody in this part of the world, and even beyond those borders. So we're trying to find ways to overcome this we-them thinking. That is what this organization is about. And heritage has that potential in it, and it's about finding that potential. So I don't know. It's not an answer, it's more a reply.
That's exactly the topic of the Cyprus group, peace building.
Bueno, también un poco hablando de lo que estamos viendo hoy aquí, o sea, el Beato se crea justamente en una situación que, como que la está describiendo la señora, mucho más exacerbada, ¿no? Entonces, o sea, nosotros estamos anonadado delante de una belleza que se crea justamente, como lo hicieron ver en un mapa, pues en un momento en el cual estaba toda islamizada Europa, ¿no? Quizás, más que pensar en estos términos generales, diré yo, se podría pensar como una acción individual, ¿no? de estas personas, ¿no? De estos artistas, o según cada uno, según su, de poder ir al fondo, ¿no? Dentro de una mentalidad más superficial, de poder ir al fondo con algunas cuestiones que son unificadoras, porque seguramente también, como el profesor Castañera hacía notar, ¿no? Cuánta analogía hay también con África, con otras cosas. Entonces, que este lugar del encuentro, que es la belleza, ¿no? Digamos, es también una gran ocasión, ¿no? En lugar de ser en lugar de la inamistad, ¿no? Creo yo.
Y en este sentido, por añadir un poquito más, en este sentido, FRH, Future for Religious Heritage, el futuro para el patrimonio religioso, implica poner a un lado, como hemos más o menos todos ido señalando, las diferencias para poner por encima las commonalities, lo que nos une, porque lo que nosotros abogamos todos, y creo que hablo por todos, y estoy segura que ustedes también, es el hecho de que no se puede utilizar este patrimonio para esgrimir ningún otro mensaje más que el que es. Entonces, ya está bien de que cojamos precisamente aquello que es como lo más identitario, lo que traemos todos en la raíz, para hacer daño al otro. Y por desgracia, el patrimonio arquitectónico religioso, ya sean iglesias, monasterios, sinagogas, mezquitas, da igual, lo hacía gente de paz, lo hacía gente que se sublimaba con todo este arte. Y como muchísimas veces, a mí esto me lo enseñó Chiara hace mucho tiempo, el tema del tiempo, precisamente. Nadie veía una catedral terminada. Nadie veía una... Porque eran generaciones y generaciones contribuyendo, europeos de una manera y de la otra. Unos venían, otros iban, y era todo gente que utilizaba esto para algo mayor que sí mismos, para trascender. Por eso hoy heredamos estas maravillas, porque no pensaban en sí mismos. Entonces, lo que a mí especialmente me duele es cómo se utiliza el patrimonio religioso-cultural para esgrimir otro tipo de mensaje, que es más un ismo, un egoísmo al final. ¿Sí? Yo creo que hablo por todos, no sé si alguien quiere puntualizar en este sentido.
Sobre este tema del tiempo, rehaciéndose también cómo, ¿no? Transmitirlo hoy, también podemos aprender, porque ahora la intención siempre de cristalizar, ¿no? Todo el patrimonio. Y entonces tú vas a ver algo que es así y ya está, ¿no? Mientras siempre la catedral se ha visto como algo que cada vez que volvía había una novedad, ¿no? Que es lo que está pasando ahora, por ejemplo, en la Sagrada Familia, que cada vez que uno va, pues hay algo nuevo. Entonces, por siglos, pues cada año tú ibas y veías una cosa nueva. Y esto da la posibilidad de realmente de volver y volver y volver y desarrollar esta capacidad de comprender, ¿no? En el tiempo, cosa que hoy con esta estructura museística, ¿no? Que entonces el patrimonio, nos escandalizamos si una iglesia se transforma en un garaje o en un gimnasio, como últimamente ha pasado en Barcelona, por ejemplo, pero no, igual tendremos que escandalizarnos, yo creo sinceramente, si también impedimos, no podemos hacer nada en ella, ¿no? En el sentido que no se puede tener la posibilidad de introducir algo que nos haga decir qué bello es, ¿no? Que, ay, qué bonito, una sorpresa, ¿no? De podernos sorprender de nuevo.
Y en términos de ir, venir, agrupar lo que somos, de donde venimos y estos movimientos de arte, cuando he visto las imágenes del profesor Castiñeiras, de las imágenes antiguas que yo no había visto de la mezquita de Córdoba, se me puso una cosa aquí. Recuerdo la primera vez que yo viajé a Córdoba y tuve la suerte de que me alojaron en el hotel que estaba enfrente. Claro, llegas a tu ritmo a dar una ponencia, no sé qué, y cuando abro la ventana por la mañana y me la encuentro así, fue como, estoy dentro de un beato. O sea, al final, y era, pues, es que es verdad, ¿te acuerdas? Sí, yo estaba, y tuve que verla, y verla, y verla, y darle vueltas y vueltas, porque era estar en mi casa. O sea, a mí eso me parece maravilloso. Sí, es como...
En mi pregunta era que si ustedes tienen confianza
Sí.
que en el futuro podremos intercambiar culturas con la misma naturalidad con que se ha venido haciendo hasta ahora.
Sí, y
no,
ahora.
no ven amenaza.
Y ahora.
Yo creo que Sarah Lankenstein ha dado un muy buen ejemplo de eso.
Sí.
Que los hijos de los inmigrantes en París se ven su propia identidad reflejada en la abadía de Saint-Denis. Eso es todo. Eso lo dice.
Lo dice
y
todo.
es su propia voluntad. Ellos han escogido esto como la Stade de France. Perfecto.
Sí. Quería decir algo a la pregunta de ella, y es que yo no soy un experto en Islam, pero sí que a veces, a través de la televisión, a través de los medios de comunicación, nos dan una imagen un poco sesgada. O sea, el Islam tiene toda una tendencia, que hay millones, que es una tendencia de la tolerancia y del diálogo. Yo he estado en agosto en Albania, que es un país de mayoría musulmana, y en Albania la corriente es esta corriente de la tolerancia de las religiones. Es un país donde viven católicos, ortodoxos y musulmanes, y no hay ningún problema. Es decir, que a veces yo vivo en Cataluña, donde hay muchos inmigrantes como en Francia, y sí es cierto que a veces se transmite eso, ¿no? También sabemos que hay una parte intolerante del Islam que está muy promocionada,
Bueno,
como
sí.
lo hay de otras religiones. Pero creo que hay esperanzas. Espero que haya esperanzas.
Eso es lo que yo deseaba escuchar. Gracias.
Sí.
Maybe I can. Maybe I can add an example, because in the city of Groningen, because the whole day was about art without borders, in a way, and in the city of Groningen we have a big cathedral church, not cathedral, but big church, and as the Groningen churches, we organized an exhibition there, which was actually called Art Without Borders, and we showed Iranian draftsmen in the church. And even better, I would say, we also showed Iranian, the same group of people, in a synagogue. So, and it was really intended also to show that art doesn't know any borders, that there is a mutual influence, whether you're at war or not, because in Iran, people cannot easily make drawings, it's forbidden. But they go underground. They made beautiful drawings, which were also actually inspired by Christianity. So it was a real nice mixture of different influences, what we talked about here, but then in a contemporary context. And we showed it in our church. We showed it in our synagogue. And the intention was to create dialogue and to let people look at with their own eyes, that it's not as well. You try to say it's not as polarized or what people think. Art travels beyond these things, and I think that's the good thing that art should do. And earlier on, it was said that art is beauty, and therefore we think it's nice. But art is also meant to sharpen our minds and to think and to look at the world from another perspective. And I think that's also partly what we try to do with our buildings, which are, of course, they have a history, but to organize events or to show other art within that building, you create a dialogue, but you also plant a seed to think about its history and to go deeper into that history. So maybe that's also a nice answer.
Yeah, and also just there's another dimension to what you're doing, and it ties in, Lillian, you talked about new knowledge, but what you're talking about is also new culture. It's creating new culture. And in terms of making religious heritage relevant, meaningful today, it's also a generator of new culture, and that keeps it relevant, that keeps it speaking to today's society.
I would like to add, as today...
The first one?
Sorry, I didn't know. No, go ahead.
Okay. Coming back to the town, because I don't want to talk about the Beatos, it's not my field. But the final chapter of Apocalypse, Jerusalem, definitely Jerusalem hasn't any more temple because it's not necessary, because finally is the common space a great temple. So I think that many people is looking for spaces for their spirituality. Think about museums. The sense of the sacred that people inside museum is looking for.
Yeah.
Or other kind of spaces where people can rest in silence or sharing dialogue. So I think that our heritage is full of beauty, is full of interest, is full of art. But if we try to use it as a common space, as a town, I don't say without temples now, because it could be seen too strong, but as if the temple is a part of the town, of the streets, of the places, of the markets, like history teaches us when the first Franciscans were in the markets, and so the rest. So it's always a pity when I see a church with the doors closed. Yeah. And now there is a lot of issues of security, preservation, and so on. But every door closed is a part of the town that is not accessible. Yeah. So every kind of activity of hope can help to open doors, every kind of doors. For example, also in coming back to the topic of Islam, in Turin, many suburbs are full of mosques. And so when they have their feasts, when they have festivals, when they have mosques with door open, is very beautiful because, or during COVID, for example, the parish churches and the mosques had a common network of supporting all the people, for example.
Yeah, amazing.
And so
work.
this was really an urban dimension of or young children in my parish. Nobody asked them playing football together, which religion they are, but they feel a common future in this kind of suburb, industrial suburb, post-industrial suburb, to share experiences together. And if places are beautiful, it's better, I think.
I think so. Well, I don't need that. I just want to contribute that saying heritage contributes to intercultural dialogue, for sure, always. That's also done today. It was proven during this conference as a meeting place. Heritage and cultural heritage is a common meeting place where people can share common values, discuss differences, and learn from the past to inform the present and future. Through its various tangible and intangible elements, heritage provides a basis for connection and exchange and hope, allowing individuals to understand different societies and their complex interactions. And this is how we should use this heritage in a positive manner. Of course, there are always people who try to use it for their own benefits, but I think this is the message, as you said, it is a meeting place. A meeting place, a common ground. It overcomes differences, but the first thing is knowledge, because you judge people because you do not know enough. Once you start a dialogue with somebody or about any religion, you understand better, and then there you find the common grounds because they are there. So this is also, as you said, it is a change in culture, but this change in culture has been many ages. It is a kind of reflection, but it is all about people. And so if people keep going on with this dialogue, then there is hope for everything, I think, as an answer to your specific question.
Ahora, nos van a tener que disculpar, pero ya son las 6 de la tarde y tenemos una última pregunta, ¿puede ser? Sí,
vale. Sí, nada, simplemente rápidamente en relación con lo que se estaba comentando, decirle que la Comisión Islámica de España trabaja intensamente por fortalecer la convivencia en España con otras formas de pensamiento, con las universidades, y lo hace cotidianamente. Yo creo que el problema que tenemos de generar este discurso a veces es precisamente lo que estamos tratando hoy aquí, que se ha borrado el patrimonio religioso, la herencia religiosa de 8 siglos de presencia musulmana en España. Si fijamos, como se hace en algunos discursos políticos, el origen de la identidad española en el final de la Reconquista, en 1492, pues tendríamos 5 siglos de cristianismo y todavía nos quedarían 3 siglos más para llegar a igualar lo que es la herencia musulmana, ¿no? Cuando hablamos de patrimonio religioso, hablamos de libertad religiosa. Y yo creo que una de las grandes herencias que ha habido precisamente en Europa es la libertad religiosa, que es un derecho humano, que es un derecho constitucional y que además garantiza el derecho a la libertad de desarrollo de la personalidad de cada persona. Yo creo que es eso lo que defiende el patrimonio y lo que tenemos que defender. Y ahí yo quería también lanzar en respuesta a la pregunta original, con el profesor, con Manuel Castiñeira, hemos visto esta mañana cómo se puede ir, sobre todo pensando en jóvenes, de la realidad de la persona, de los jóvenes, hacia el texto, hacia el Beato, ¿no? Y a mí me parece que es muy interesante también el camino inverso, es decir, nosotros cómo podemos llevar cómo podemos alfabetizar en lo religioso a una generación de jóvenes que ya no lo tiene, ¿no? Y a mí me parece que en ese sentido la experiencia francesa puede ser extraordinariamente interesante. Yo tuve la experiencia de un viaje por las iglesias de Bretaña, saliendo de aquí, de Cantabria, y fuimos por todas las iglesias que nos pillaron en el camino, a las iglesias de Bretaña, y habéis conseguido hacer experiencias artísticas súper creativas de alfabetización de lo religioso. Ejemplo, en una de las iglesias había una nave, estaba completamente destruida, rehabilitada, donde se veían las huellas del tiempo, toda vacía, y solamente había una pintura, como una especie de graffiti, que decía: ¿qué he hecho de mi bautismo? Entonces, y en cada iglesia había un intento de alfabetización de lo religioso para un público joven o para un público... Nosotros lo tenemos aquí, nosotros vivimos al lado de San Vicente de la Barquera, es una iglesia impresionante que la visitan miles de personas, pero que ya no la entienden, ¿no? Entonces, esta idea de lo creativo, lo joven, a la alfabetización religiosa, ¿no? Me parece interesantísima.
Thank you very much for your comments, because what I would like to, and then we need to close.
Yes, we need.
It's very interesting what you say, because also in one of our churches in Groningen, we have a medieval tower where we confront. Does it work?
Can you?
Sí.
Gracias.
Yeah, thank you. Ooh, okay, that was very loud. We have a medieval tower in which we bring along young classes to know what they celebrate. It's a national project which was initiated by Museum Catharijnenconvent in Utrecht. And we were approached to also make an exhibition, and we decided we wanted to make an exhibition about Christian holidays and Islamic holidays. And the idea was that children would learn about each other's holidays, because classes are now so multicultural. And what you then see is that children, they were not like you go up the tower and you go through Christian holidays and then down the tower, the Islamic. No, they were sort of mingled. So you walk through the different holidays or feasts, and again to create dialogue, and again to show children already at an early age that there are also similarities. So the common ground, what we've all been talking about as well, is also in knowing and about knowledge, knowing what you celebrate, because in Holland a lot of children don't know anymore where Christmas came from. Or how do you say it? So that's why we made this exhibition, and we did it with contemporary designers. So we also used a new language in image. So well, if you ever travel around, I would invite you to go there. It's really nice.
So, bueno, como vemos, el tiempo es finito, esto es una cosa que sabemos todos antes de haber empezado este congreso, y toca finalizar. Ha sido un placer, esto es un sueño cumplido, y creo que todos tenemos claro que toda la comarca de Liébana, toda Cantabria, está celebrando este encuentro con nosotros. Hemos visto cómo hasta los alcaldes del camino han venido y han querido estar aquí apoyando. Agradezco muchísimo a todos y cada uno de los miembros de FRH por la contribución, por el esfuerzo de estar aquí, por todo lo que estamos trayendo. Agradezco muchísimo a nuestros superponentes increíbles, la generosidad con la que nos han aportado todo lo que han traído, y agradezco a todas las personas presentes y los que no están de cuerpo presente, que están en streaming, que hayan seguido y que compartamos todos esto. Y desde luego las cosas se cambian con la gente. Estamos aquí porque todos tenemos una idea común y tenemos un espíritu común, que es preservar, difundir y transmitir, ¿sí?, a las nuevas generaciones. Entonces, espero que esto no sea una única vez. Para mí, en la Carta a los Reyes este año yo voy a poner que esto no sea el Congreso Internacional, ahí pone primer Congreso Internacional, ¿sí? Y bueno, les conmino a todos a que compartan esto con nosotros y esperemos poder volver a repetirlo, que serán momentos de muchísimo... momentos muy fuertes de compartir un montón de ideas que, como vemos, cada uno trae una o tres. Yo he hecho lo posible para hacer una sola pregunta y tenía 6, pero dije, bueno, vamos a hacer una sola y fíjense que ya nos hemos pasado 10 minutos. Así que muchísimas gracias a todo el equipo que está detrás de nosotros apoyando y haciendo que todo esto salga bien, y a nuestras magníficas traductoras incansables que no se lo hemos puesto fácil, seguro. Bueno, pues ahora tenemos planteado, los miembros de FRH ya tienen que bajar, sí, y los ponentes tienen que bajar a Santander. Ya digo, bueno, decimos bajar porque estamos en la montaña y vamos a la costa, pero vamos, es desplazarse, ¿sí?
And thank you, Pilar.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Bien.